Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 9, Conspiracy. Tioric's men were brutal, and their methods crude. There would be no attempt to appease the lowly commoners who had risen in support of the banished king. Examples would be made. There was a new order in place, one that would not tolerate insubordination and disloyalty. The cycles of indecision and uncertainty were over. Not trusting his newly appointed captains as yet, Tioric personally took command of the soldiers marching on Nemona. This somewhat remote town in the far east of Estium seemed to be the rallying point for those still sympathetic towards Tregoran. Now that the old king had been moved to the capital of their province, the foolish citizens might just get it into their heads to attempt setting him at liberty again in Amherst. Duke Perian would take responsibility for the defense of his capital, as well as the semi-incarceration of the former king and queen. An additional watch was set on his 3 remaining married daughters and their husbands, though Tioric expected little trouble from those quarters. His men assembled in Amherst, where he joined them. 800 soldiers, their loyalty purchased by gold and promises, marched northeastwards through the cold days and freezing nights of leasing. Initially, the morale was high. There would be spoils to acquire in the town of Nemona, and rich farmsteads to loot in the surrounding countryside. One could endure a little cold and discomfort at such a prospect. The men of Nemona made a half-hearted stand outside the town, and were easily scattered. It seemed there arose an opportunity now to persuade the wavering citizenry, even if half the argument to sway them was made up of an ill-disciplined force about to be let loose on their property. Tioric ignored it, still angered by the nerve these peasants had displayed in opposing him openly. 2 days he gave the men to satisfy their craving for plunder. In those 2 days he lost the hearts of the people of Nemona irrevocably. Malvor had Haldred's messenger brought to him again on the morning after his arrival. There was no longer any reason to doubt the warnings, subtle and otherwise, that had accumulated since his arrival in the south. Still, a nagging thought persisted. Could it be that Tioric, fearing an Urian build-up on his southern border, combined with an invasion from the north, had sent this messenger himself in order to lure away Malvor's force from Nicoma? The Ligurian king would expect the captain to draw his troops away to Breck, or even further, thus neutralizing the threat they posed for a season at least. But then Hasar was not Tioric's man, or was he? The only way to discover the truth was to wrench it from the young man himself. Admittedly, the youth would not have known about that obscure conversation he had had with the princess. Could she be part of the ploy as well? Varus still had a haggard look about him when he entered. He had begged leave to depart this morning, to return to his mistress, though he was obviously in no fit state to undertake the journey. His devotion, at least, seemed real enough. Would he be so insistent if Princess Haldred was in no real danger? Malvor launched questions at him in quick succession, from the time Julas had fallen in the ambush to the moment the youth had made his escape from Freyne's Point. He was soon convinced of the truthfulness of his responses. His sense of shame at what he termed his failure during the attack on their train was all too real. His answers were accurate and did not contradict one another. As the complete picture unfolded before him, Malvor became acutely aware of the impossible situation in which they found themselves. If anything was to be done, it had to be done right away.
How far is Strange Point from Breck?
It took me 6 days to travel the distance, but I walked only at night. If one could use the daylight, it should be 4 at the most.
How many men?
Harris considered the question carefully.
It is very hard to say. I did not see the whole encampment, but there would be more than 1,000, and they keep many thousands prisoner.
Malvor frowned, and made quick calculations in his thoughts. It would be best to march his men to the waste as soon as they could be fetched back from Nicoma, and destroy the scourge before it became an irresistible menace. If only the troops he had raised in Lysan were at his disposal for such an enterprise. Now his promise to keep the men of Lysan within the borders of their homeland came back to haunt him. Trying to convince them of the danger in the waste without hard evidence would be impossible. He could see their disbelieving faces, their indignation at this pathetic attempt to go back on his word. He had 400 hillmen from Nuria, the order of his king to keep them on the Ligurian border, and an unassailable enemy to face. Moreover, the defenses of Breck were still in complete disrepair. His mind worked feverishly. Earthworks, fire pits, tall spikes, war machines. Perhaps the stone he had accumulated at such risk and with so much difficulty would not be wasted after all. The best he could do was to bring his Nurians back to Breck, to aid in its defense. They would be overrun in no time if they remained where they were. He would send warnings to Tregoran and Fengor, let them believe what they wanted. There was no reason to doubt his word, at least not for Fengor. They would have time to prepare. A sudden panicky thought escaped before he could stifle it. He would be the sacrifice, he and the people of Lysan. Should he not at least attempt to convince them? Have the towns evacuated, fall back to Ligurium? He knew virtually nothing about the swarm. What would be their weaknesses? How did one go about defeating them? Was there a man alive in Myril who still knew? Asar brought him the shocking intelligence. Turik had seized control of Ligurium. It was not an altogether peaceful takeover either. There was trouble in the east, and violent measures by the new king. Did Fengor know about this? Did he approve of it? Ligurium could do with a more vigorous ruler, especially at a time like this. That was true. But now they could not afford civil strife, or the awakening of old rivalries. Malvor would have to adapt his plans. The situation to the north had deteriorated. He remembered Fengor's warning that he might have to march the Nurians north into Ligurium. Did Fengor back Turik or Tregoran? Perhaps he backed neither. It would not be surprising if he wanted the control over Ligurium for himself. It would be best to warn all the parties involved. The first messenger would still go to Tregoran, but would no longer carry a written message. Malvor was most careful in his instruction.
You will find the former king in Amrys. How you might reach him, I do not know. Speak the message only to him or the queen. Speak to no one else about this matter. Make your way back here with any reply there may be. Do not drag your feet. The little time left before the hammer will fall is not an exaggeration.
The second man would go to Turik with a sealed message and proceed further to warn Fengor in Nuria. Certainly the king would send his captain in Lysan new instructions after he received it. Even if he did not, the captain would prepare for the coming storm as best he could. desert days dragged by in an agony of apprehension. Haldred waited for the hours to pass, till she could be certain Maris had not been caught, even if he had perished in the desert, and her warning had not reached Brek. She waited for the summons from Hekan that would seal her unwilling sacrifice. She waited for the cycle to descend into darkness, and the rising tide of horror to begin its inexorable flow. What more could be done? All she was able to do, the warning sent, had been accomplished. Yet now it seemed so little to her, so ineffectual compared to the enormity of the danger. But she was no bold captain to challenge the oppressor, or free the oppressed by her great deeds. And even if she had been, there was no way a single person could accomplish anything against this vast operation of evil. The slaves were beyond aid, condemned to a horrible fate, unreachable, so many hundreds. If only they could be armed, given an opportunity, Hekan could be overthrown. How would she accomplish such a task? It was hard to imagine where one would start. Oh, it was a foolish dream. Still, if the attempt was never made, the unthinkable would become the inevitable. She needed information. The comings and goings of the guards, Hekan's schedule, the exact day he would unleash the hordes. Somehow these things would have to be investigated, though she had little idea how. Now she sorely missed Maris and his ability to gather intelligence. She needed agents, spies, to put their ears to the ground in every dark corner of the tent city, even Hekan Seer's private quarters. But who could be trusted in this wild and forlorn place? Cura would have to be won over completely. She had friends throughout the house, who would in their turn have friends, perchance among the guards or even the captains. The whole process of gathering intelligence could be easier than she anticipated. Haldred cornered the girl the very next morning during her preparation. Cura was still giggling over the most recent gossip, while tying up the hair of her mistress. The first question was almost casual, as if it proceeded naturally from what was under discussion.
What do you really think of Hekan Seer?
I admire him. He is not like most Physians. He knows how to treat a woman, and he is handsome.
What do you know of the mission he performs for Horan here at Frane's Point?
Not much. I think it involves the horrors in the caves. He is to keep an eye on them.
She stared at Haldred, her eyes large.
Is that what you saw the other night? Do you think it could be the Drak?
Haldred was nonplussed.
Drak?
Yes, the legend. Long ago, there were creatures without count that destroy everything in their path.
Cura covered her mouth with her hands. Haldred found it incredible that the silly girl would only think of it now. How long had she been in this camp?
The Swarm. It is called the Swarm in Ligerium.
She gripped the girl by the shoulders.
Yes, I believe it involves the terrible beasts in the caves. He has come to stir them up into another swarm. That is why there are so many slaves here, with almost no work to do. They are not here to work. They are here to feed the creatures of the waste.
Cura turned pale. All traces of her cheerful manner had disappeared. In place of it remained only a sad frown of incredulity, slowly settling into resignation. She had seen too many evidences casually ignored, too many half-perceived oddities now becoming clear, to doubt the truth any longer. She took hold of Haldred's hands.
What shall we do?
Haldred tried to sound reassuring.
If you help me, we could do much.
The girl stared, afraid but eager.
Of course I will help. I'll do anything.
She suddenly looked down.
At least, almost anything. I couldn't...
She grimaced as if in pain.
I couldn't go into those caves. Please, I couldn't do that.
Haldred smiled.
I don't think I could do it either.
But you went the other night.
That's before I knew what was in there.
She shuddered at the memory.
There is nothing we can do there anyway. No, we will make our plans here among the tents, and try to do something for the slaves before they are cast into those caverns.
The news echoed through the entire house before the morning watch had ended. Hekan had struck and killed his first wife. No one knew for certain why he had done it, but there were several suggestions. The most frightening to Haldred was almost the most believable. A rumor circulated that the woman, a former Burian resident of Hurst in Lysan, had been caught attempting to send a warning to her people still living there. A palace servant, missing from his place of duty, had been chased down in the desert and confessed under torture. No event could have galvanized Kira's support like this did. Her childish romantic notions concerning the powerful, ruthless, and handsome desert lord evaporated. The first wife had been popular, in spite of the extreme competition in the house, and her beauty a matter of pride for all those serving there. Once the girl had shed her tears of shock and spoken her agonizing short phrases of astonishment, her heart had turned completely against her formerly idolized master. Kira brought 3 more girls she believed could be trusted. Since the violent murder in the house, there had been a not-so-subtle change in the atmosphere, even though it had also been meant to intimidate the inmates and prevent other attempts at sneaking out messages to outsiders. Hekan had done his cause much harm with the sudden and open brutality of his action. Fear made a poor substitute for devotion. Haldred accepted any and every social invitation directed at her. Whenever there was contact with the other woman of the house, she tried, through questioning she hoped was subtle, to learn more of its operation and its routines. The Chamberlain, Bandar, kept the place in meticulous order. He was a creature of habit, and the slightest stirring inside the house had to match his time schedule. Slaves were sent out, supplies delivered, and meals distributed at exact hours. The same guards were on duty at the same posts every day, and if someone was out of position, the punishment was swift and severe. Outside, in the city and caverns, affairs were not so easy to control. There were at least 7 overseers to organize the daily comings and goings, and 2 chiefs who hardly left the caverns except to take their meals and rest. Haldred had decided early on that any stirring she could do would have to be done outside the caverns, though she was aware of the fact that there were many more slaves imprisoned inside than out. The difficulty of reaching that majority marginalized their chances of succeeding. If the tent city could be captured, there would be an attempt made to free these unfortunates too. Kira brought news of a slave with seemingly more influence than the others. Balos, a Ligerian captured 2 cycles before, had been in Hekan's service during most of that time. He knew Freyne's Point inside out, since he had hauled water with a team of slaves for the last 9 seasons, delivering to the tents and the furthest caverns. He was a familiar sight to most of the guards and overseers, who no longer gave him a second glance. This man had contact with many hundreds of slaves. Certainly, he would be of great help to their cause. The girl even knew where he was kept, in the older section of the city bordering Hekan's house. A nightly visit could be arranged. Haldred's pulse quickened. The dream was no longer such an impossible one. If this man would join their conspiracy, something significant could be done. But how would she get into the slave tents? She had Hekan's pass. If the guards would not recognize her from before, still it was a terrible risk to take. One question raised, and the overseer would be summoned. He had reason not to forget her. What would she tell him? That there was another son of hers lost among the slaves? She retrieved the note from its hiding place. She read it through quickly.
I have granted Princess Haldred access to the holding chambers and cells. Allow her to remove the person she requires to be taken to the palace.
It did not say that the person was her young son, nor was the date specified. If only the guard on duty was ignorant of her history here, the ploy would succeed again. But if gossip had reached him of her doings in the other tents, he might know that the person she had desired had already been removed from captivity there. There was no other way. It was a chance she would have to take. The heavy veil was like armor, protecting her from the suspicions and hostility of the keepers. Kira was at her elbow, a welcome presence, steeling her resolve against the frightful night. The guards frowned at them, looking up from their evening meal with irritation. Haldred knew she had no right to be outside the palace. Only extraordinary circumstances would allow for breaking this strict rule. She would not enter here or anywhere else without close scrutiny. Cura held out the scroll to the men, who glanced at it with suspicion. She pretended to be worn out with a day's fruitless searching, and complained of aching feet. Haldred noticed that her hand shook a little as she kept the scroll under their noses for inspection. A similar trembling started in her own body. Briefly she wondered where the bravado of her first days here had gone. The men were loath to leave their food. Cura assured them quickly that they could find their own way, and took a torch from the wall without waiting for a reply. Motioning to Haldred, she stepped by accident into an anteroom instead of the main passage leading to the slaves' quarters. Haldred struggled against her rising terror. Quickly she reproached Cura in sharp tones, pretending her impatience. The guards glanced at her bemusedly. The girl raised her hands in apology, scurrying back and down the dark tunnel, her supposedly aching feet imbued with new energy. Haldred felt the sick nervousness decrease the further they moved from the guard-room at the entrance. The place was not quite as frightening as the first tent she had seen. The prisoners here were used for labor. Their food and treatment was much better than that of the more recent arrivals. They also saw the outside world regularly, escaping from the cooped-up horror of their canvas prison every day. Cura risked inquiring from a slave where Balos was kept. The man, chained in the same way as the slaves elsewhere, looked at her strangely before nodding towards the back of the chamber they were in. He did not say a word. The women made their way to the back of the tent, right to the canvas wall, and spoke his name out loud. Tired, hopeless eyes turned in their direction. A dark-haired, strongly built man, his beard long and scraggly, replied. "Yes?" Haldred hurried over to him and squatted down. He was chained with 3 other men. What would be said between them could not remain a secret. She did not look at the others. They had no idea who she was. Balos stared at her with curiosity. She kept her voice as low as she could, while still allowing him to hear what she said.
You are Ligerian?
He shrugged. "I used to be."
Do you know why you have been brought here to Frane's Point?
He did not answer immediately. Instead he asked, "Who are you?"
Someone who believes it is not too late to prevent this tragedy from unfolding.
"What tragedy?"
You have been here for 2 cycles, and you still don't know.
He brought up his free hand to rub his bearded chin. "I may know, but do you?" He did not trust her. That much was obvious. Haldred decided to throw caution to the wind.
The swarm they are breeding in the caverns, to be fed with the masses of captives and the droves of cattle they have brought here. It is only the beginning. These hordes are to be set loose on Ligerium and her neighbors by the darkening of the cycle. Are we thinking of the same tragedy?
He nodded slowly. "What of it?"
There is little time left, but the only power to stop this madman resides here, within these tents. The captives outnumber Hekan's soldiers. They can overthrow him and destroy the scourge before it has a chance to wreak the havoc he is planning.
Balos looked at her intensely for a few moments, but then he shook his head.
We will simply die. There is no way to do what you suggest.
Haldred could not believe what she had heard. Ought not desperation and the gravity of his situation drive this man to some kind of action? She spoke as loudly as she dared.
You will simply die anyway, screaming in agony as the swarmlings tear your flesh from your cowardly bones. Would you not prefer to go quickly and cleanly, as a man should go?
Again the hand reached up. He stared past her, apparently deep in thought.
This is not some kind of trap.
You are already trapped. What more could be taken from you?
How will it be done?
Firstly, every last slave within your reach will need to know exactly what Hekan's intentions are for them. That will give them the will to resist, if not the means as yet. Secondly, we will have to coordinate our attack to occur simultaneously in every corner of the city, even underground in the caverns. If the slaves all rise at the same time, Hekan's men will be hard-pressed. We have a much better chance of success. Someone will have to inform these slaves of the exact hour of the uprising.
Balos was nodding as she spoke. Perhaps there was a chance after all.
That someone will be me.
Yes, if you agree to it. You will give me a list of what you need, and I will do my utmost to supply it to you.
For the first time, his eyes glimmered in the torchlight. You have access to weapons?
No, we will plan the uprising to take place in the middle of the night, when there are the fewest guards about. The weapons acquired from these will have to serve us initially. We will discover where their arms are kept and launch our first assault there.
Balos raised his manacled arm.
We will need keys to get us out of the chains. 2 or 3 per room. That will be between 40 and 60 for the outside. Inside the caves there are no chains, but cages with strong locks. I have never seen keys for those. Perhaps they could be broken by a hammer. All these would have to be smuggled into the cells by my water team. This will take time. A 10-day, I think, or more.
We will start work on it immediately.
Who the we would be, Haldred had no idea as yet. But Balos needed not know that.
How will we communicate?
He asked.
When you replenish the water supply of the palace, this girl,
She indicated Cura, who briefly lifted her veil.
will linger there every day with a message. Send word to me through her.
Balos nodded slowly. His frowning face was set in what looked like determination. Haldred rose to her feet and turned to leave. The slave's final whisper gave her a moment's pause.
Imran preserve thee, Princess Haldred.
Maris returned the very next day, shortly after sunset. Cura gave a little squeal of delight as she saw his head appear through the tent flap. She hurried him inside, fussing over the weakened state he appeared to be in, but the youth gently evaded her efforts to make him comfortable. Haldred could see he was worn out, and when he made an attempt to bow before her, she stopped him.
Don't leave me in suspense. Did you reach Captain Malvor? Speak.
He nodded, and a shock of relief whirled through her. Cura stood beside him with a cup of water. Haldred made an impatient gesture as he looked at her for permission. The young man's servile attitude could irritate her at times. The girl took the empty cup from him and waited to see if he wanted more. Maris removed the headcloth that had protected him from the sun and dust, and folded it carefully. Haldred twisted her hands together. The youth spoke with difficulty, his voice hoarse.
I told the captain what you said, Princess.
He swallowed and looked longingly at the empty cup in Cura's hands. The girl rushed off to fetch more water.
He believed the message and will warn Count Turic and King Fengor.
Wait. Why Count Turic? And what about my father?
Maris seemed ill at ease.
I am sorry, Lady Haldred, to tell you this. Count Turic has been appointed king by your father, but there are rumors that he was forced to do it. King Tregoran is in Amorous with the Queen. I believe Captain Malvor will warn them also.
Haldred turned away from him. Turic, the viper, had finally struck. Somehow she expected such treachery from him. King of Ligurium, indeed. This would never have happened had Vengus been alive. She remembered the letter from her brother, and the false words spoken by her cousin after she had read it. Then she had been certain of his insatiable ambition. Now he had achieved his goal, in time to be ground into dust by the plotting of other more powerful lords. A deserved fate. Would he even listen to the warning? Surely the Nurian king would. There would be time to prepare the fire pits of Vindar's line, time to move weak ones out of the way of war. Ligurium would not be caught unawares. Her poor father, now to live under the watchful eye of Perian. But at least he would know that she was still alive. She remembered more important issues. Maris waited with averted eyes.
What will Malvor do?
He wanted to bring his soldiers here, but I do not think he is able to. There is trouble between Ligurium and the Nurians. Everyone is nervous. He will stay in Breck and try to defend it.
The poor man. He will die there, unless we can do something to aid him.
Maris looked at her with a puzzled expression.
What could we possibly do to aid him?
The fashioning of the keys proved to be the most challenging of their tasks. There were several smithies in Hekan's camp, but getting access to any one of them was hazardous in the extreme. The casting had to be done at night, when there was no one about. A fire had to be lit again, and shielded so that it would not be noticed from outside. A mold had to be fashioned from a clay imprint Balos had smuggled out to Cura. The metal melted and poured, and the casting cooled, fitted, and filed before a single key was produced. At any time, a passing guard could notice their operations and report them. How could they ever produce 40 such keys over the next 10 nights? Haldred quickly realized that they would not have been able to produce even one key if it had not been for Maris. Cura, who would only be in the way in a smithy, kept watch for them, while she and the youth battled with the forge, the heavy tools, the cumbersome bellows. It seemed to Haldred that eternity would pass before they had just one workable key. She acquired the habit of sleeping during the day. Her investigations in the parlors of Hekan's concubines were scaled down to 1 or 2 per day. It was dangerous to attempt espionage while dull of thought through lack of sleep. Even so, she had a fairly good notion of the master's movements in and out of the camp, and learned the details of the planned withdrawal of his household and soldiers just before the darkening. This, more than anything, confirmed that their estimation of time for the swarm's release was correct. Haldred grew cold as she listened to the speculation and gossip. There were many contradictory details, but all were sure of the day on which it would take place. Hekan and his minions would abandon the slaves to their fate on the very last day of leasing. Maris had clever hands, she soon realized. He would be a master craftsman given the opportunity, and provided they ever escaped the house of Hekan Seer. She watched him forge the keys they needed, struggling at first, but growing more confident and adept night after night. He needed her for little things only, to grip the mold and turn it, or touch the bellows at times, but mostly he did the crafting by himself. Only once he had asked her to attempt an escape with him through the desert. It was dangerous, he said, but not more so than staying in this place. He had slipped out of the camp and back in again. It could be done. But she had reminded him that there would be nothing left of Ligerium, or Lysan, perhaps Nuria, if Hekan carried out his commission here. Where would they hide? And what would they do in a world ground under Malik's heel? Would she not regret forever leaving all these people to their fate, while she could have done something to prevent it? He had not replied to her questions, but she could see he was not in agreement with her. In the end, he was swayed by the fact that Arid could not be left behind, and it would be extremely difficult to effect an escape with a small child in tow. The Wanderer had already appeared in the early morning sky. Pelia, the Faithless, on her cyclic journey of futility, soon would spread her blue robe about Imran's orb for the 11 days of the darkening. And this time, like all the other times before it, and all those that would follow, she would be sent on her way again to continue her exile, the heart of Imran unmoved by her pleas. Since she could remember, Haldred had been touched by the sad hopelessness of it. As a little girl, she had blamed the unmoving god of battles, and felt great pity for his exiled wife. There was no way for her to understand that certain actions could never be made right again, or atoned for. It was only once she had tasted something of betrayal herself that her sympathy was divided between the lonely deities. Perhaps she could understand now why Imran could not take back his wife and the mother of his child. The fragile bond of trust could not be repaired, not even if his rival was destroyed and the son of her betrayal with him. It was a futile errand. Now such fanciful thoughts mattered little. Pelia's appearance heralded but one thing. The cycle was fast drawing to a close. Each day that passed, she edged closer to blocking out the sun and moving Myril towards the darkening that would see the unleashing of a tide of death. There was a glimmer of hope. 18 keys were prepared and ready for delivery. Cura carried them with her to the daily rendezvous with Balos, returning with a request or useful information from their ally. It felt good to be doing something, to have a plan in place against the dreaded day. Things were going almost too smoothly. Ekan was absent most of the time, overseeing this or that operation, and seemed to have lost interest in her for the moment. Whenever the master was not present at Freyne's Point, there was a noticeable slacking in the vigilance and performance of his men. Their routine tasks were carried out without enthusiasm or care, as men who could not conceive of a threat from their captives. Perhaps they were more watchful inside the caverns. At least the danger there was more immediate. As the season turned into its last 10-day, Haldred acquired information of vital importance. Ekan would return to oversee the moving of his camp 4 days before the Darkening. The attempt would have to be made during the night prior to that, for it would be infinitely more difficult once the master was among them again. The day being decided for her, Haldred had but to determine the hour and pass it on to Balos. The guards changed at regular intervals according to the watches of the night. The ideal time to strike would be just after the change for the third watch. Most men would be asleep at that time, and the camp enshrouded by the desert darkness. The slaves would wait for the relieved guards to disappear into the barrack tents. Silently, they would free themselves with the keys provided, overpower the men keeping watch, and acquire their weapons. They would slip out and surround the sleeping soldiers, unaware in their beds, tie up the tent flaps, and set fire to the canvas and skin covers. All the men trying to escape would be dispatched by the waiting slaves. Meanwhile, the thousands kept in the caverns would break the locks of their cages, overcome the guards, and stream out into the free night air. The animals would be freed also, and the caverns sealed with rocks. Ekan's mission would fail, and so would Malik's grand scheme. Small bands of dissidents held out in the forest east of Nimona. Their town had been sacked, their possessions looted. Many had lost family members and friends in the futile skirmishes. The men were dismayed by the display of brutality from Turik. Clearly, this was not a king to compare to Tregoran. Gone were the days of negotiation or appeasement. Their grievances would not be heard. Their objections would be met with cold steel. If this was the pattern for things to come, they were faced with a long, hard struggle. Few had the heart for it. But how would they be treated if they surrendered now? They had dared to take up weapons against their ruler, and defied him openly and declared him illegal. No doubt many in Ligurium agreed with us in their hearts, but who would stand with them now that the price of such actions was known? Unless Turik offered them amnesty, they could not think of returning home. Even if he did, they could not be certain that he would keep his word, and not have them all hanged instead. As things stood, there was no option but to keep to the thickets, moving from one shelter to another in an attempt to stay out of the soldiers' way. Perhaps more pressing concerns would weigh upon the new king soon, and he would make the unlikely offer. Turik was too calculating a man to be given to strong drink or any of the mind-affecting substances so popular among Ligurians. Yet, this dismal eventide, the invitation to indulge in such wanton, self-abusive behavior, was almost too strong to resist. 10 days he had spent chasing rebels through the eastern woodlands, but he would spend many more to subject the hard-headed Nimonians. He had waited too long for the great prize to have it ripped from his hands now. Old Tregoran still had influence, that much was clear. The uprising would end only with the old king's death. The time had come to rid himself of all potential rivals, and secure his lordship beyond doubt. The former king would not plead alone. Should Perian join him, he would have to decide soon. There was so much to be done. He fretted at the forced campaigning in this corner of the realm, when he should be in the capital, establishing his rule. But he could trust no commander as yet. Ligurium would be a nest of divided loyalties and self-serving lords for some time to come. And now this, the cursed letter from Nuria. He spread out the paper scroll for the 5th time to stare at its contents. It was still hard to believe what he read there.
Turik, on the first day of Genesis 599, you will make your last proclamation as king in Arius. You will announce to the good people of Ligurium and Estium that you are abdicating the throne in favor of the king of Nuria, after which you will invite me to enter your lands to restore order. If you do this, you may retain your title, as well as the lordship over Arius and its surrounding lands. If you do it not, your part in the disastrous Lysan campaign, your plotting against Tregaran, your cooperation with Ephesian raiders, and your complicity in the deaths of Vengus and Julos will be revealed to all. In the resulting chaos, I will take control of Ligurium and leave you with nothing. I trust that fine wit of yours that has stood you in such good stead up till now will not desert you when it matters. Believe me, it is for the best. You will not find me ungrateful. Fengor, king of Nuria, Lysan, and Ligurium.
It was only extreme restraint that kept him from ripping the paper to shreds. His hand gripped the hilt of his dagger till the fingers turned white with the effort. If he could only get his hands on that traitorous swine, he would cut out his lying, deceiving, misleading tongue and have it nailed to the city gates. Of course he would not make such a proclamation. Did the Nurian liar take him for a complete fool? If there were Ligurians who resisted the rule of a legitimate king, what would they do if a Nurian usurper attempted to steal the throne? Fengor must have lost his senses. Did Malik Julian even know of these plans? Had he simply agreed to allow Nuria these gains? Then all the lords had gone back on their sworn promises. A rising panic closed up his throat. The deceiver deceived. The many seasons he had led old Tregaran by the nose, all the promises he had made, never intending to keep them. Now he was the one who had been played false. But he would not simply hand over that out of which they were trying to cheat him now. He would see Ligurium burn to ashes first. There were sounds of movement and voices outside his tent. He glanced towards the flaps, ready to snap at the intruder. The tentative voice of the guard was muffled by the canvas between them. "Sire?" Turik stifled the sharp reply he had been prepared to give. His men should not know that he was uneasy or upset.
What is it?
"An urgent message from Brek, sire." Brek? Who commanded there? Malvor for Nuria. No doubt another ultimatum. He was on his feet. The cold was like a physical blow as he stepped outside the warmth of his campaign tent. A flaring brazier stood just outside, where the 2 guards had been joined by a 3rd, accompanying a tired-looking fellow in the colors of the Nurian field army. He was oddly relieved to see that the stranger was not a native Nurian. Placing his hands on his hips, he waited for the guard to speak. All 4 men bowed low and remained so until he bid them rise. The new guard was a man he did not know even by sight, and spoke in grave tones as if inspired by some imagined importance he had attached to the arrival of the messenger.
"Sire, this man has arrived but moments ago, and asked to be brought here to see you. He claims—"
Turik frowned him into silence. He turned towards the newcomer.
You come from Malvor.
The man looked relieved.
Yes, sire. Captain Malvor bid me greet you with good wishes for your health and prosperity.
He broke off uncertainly, misinterpreting the sudden show of anger on the face of the king. Turik nodded impatiently.
Go on.
He has entrusted this letter to me, to place into your hands and no other, after which he bid me carry it to the king of Nuria.
He bowed again and held out a sealed scroll. Turik grasped the letter and looked it over. It carried Malvor's seal, not the governor of Lysan's. The Nurian guard captain would be firmly in control of Lysan by now, raising troops for his treacherous master to march on Arius. What a fool he had been to agree to the elimination of that idiot Julos. Now the southern border was also threatened. What would Malik do? Join with the Nurians? His frown deepening, he ripped the seal and opened the scroll.
Count Turik, I have received tidings that you are in control of Ligurium and her forces.
He was addressed as Count and not King. Not surprising. Malvor had certainly received instructions from the north. He probably already knew what to do and which way the wind was blowing. Teoric was aware suddenly of the curious stares of the guards and turned his back. He read through the letter quickly, shaking his head when he reached the end. Once more he read it, and then burst out laughing. He had always suspected Malvor of being a simple man. This poor attempt to win the favor of his master was beyond stupidity. What a contemptuous oath! Such an outrageously foolish story, the same old tale that had destroyed Vengus, now supposedly corroborated by his sister. Did the captain not know that he had heard it all before? It was meant, of course, to draw the Ligurian forces southward, while the Nurian king stole across the river at Skor in the north. What did the dear captain take him for? But they all underestimated the new king of Ligurium. He had not played so long and so carefully, only to lose now. It was time to show them a different face to what they were used to seeing. Suddenly decided, he turned to the brazier and dropped the letter inside. The messenger reached forward, his face a mask of shock.
Sire, the letter must go to Nuria.
Teoric motioned to the guards, who took hold of the astonished man. The king of Ligurium, his face set in cruel determination, turned to the third guard.
Fetch me the captain and the scribe.
The man scurried off. A cold draught curled the flames round the scroll, now quickly blackening and turning to ashes. They stood unmoving, staring at it as if mesmerized, till three figures came up hastily to stand before their king. Teoric spoke without looking at them.
Place this man's head in a basket.
He motioned at the messenger, who took in his breath sharply.
Send it back to Malvor and Breck. Give him this message. Unless you surrender within 2 days of receiving my demand, this will be your fate. To spare the lives of your men, lay down your arms and march for Aruis. There you will be kept as hostages till an agreement has been reached between the kings of Ligurium and Nuria. Send back your answer with this messenger.
Cura slipped into the narrow gap between the reservoir and the cliff. It was cool, if uncomfortable, and she settled down to wait. She could hear the slaves approach long before they reached their hideout. The shouting of the guards and the occasional crack of a whip drew closer and closer till it seemed they were right next to her. She cringed away from the sounds of casual brutality, pressing her body to the rough stone. There was a pause. The slaves had halted. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moved up the stone steps beside the reservoir. Moments later, the carrier poured his water into the narrow chute at the top. The steps were quicker in descending. A whisper, low but clear, reached into her hiding place.
Message.
A shadow loomed outside the gap. She replied in the same low tone as more steps sounded outside.
There's a key for you.
The shadow crouched down to search among the loose stones at the foot of the steps. Velos spoke quickly.
Tell your mistress we can reach the first 3 caves only. They are using another team for the rest now. Tell her there are not too many Ra about anymore.
Cura did not understand.
Ra?
The man sounded impatient.
Yes, the flyers. The winged creatures in the caves. Most are in the pools now, waiting to change. She will have to reach the other caves herself. I leave something for you. Tell her to put it on her face and hands, behind her neck, to keep the Ra off her. They cannot stand the stuff. We do not go into the caves without it.
He rose abruptly and was gone. Cura held her breath, listening. Long moments passed before she stirred to have a look outside. Quickly she turned the stone and slipped the pouch hidden there into her sleeve. Overcome by curiosity, she brought it out again to peek inside. It was a powdery substance, whitish green with a pungent smell. Cura pulled away, making a face. Perhaps this concoction would persuade her mistress to enter the caves again, but she doubted it. Haldred listened to the latest tidings with dismay. There were 6 cave openings around Freyne's Point. The one she had entered and 2 more like it were situated quite close to the tent city. Velos could reach these still, he said. That left 3 others in the furthest range of hills. She had never seen the entrances there, and even if they could make their way inside unnoticed, it would be impossible to reach all the slaves in those caverns. Worst of all, she would have to endure the menacing dark again. She looked inside the little bag Balos had sent. There was something familiar about the vile odor of the substance, something that reminded her instantly of the caves. Yes, she was certain the smell was the same, though she had believed it to have come from the silent pools and whatever inhabited them. At least this powder could provide some form of protection against the horrors of the underground. Also, it was a great comfort to think that Maris would be at her side this time. Barely 2 days remained to prepare themselves. Haldred went over her plans again and again. Balos and his men knew the exact time of the breakout. They would join the men from the closer caves and deal with the soldiers. With enough powder to protect them from the Raw, she and Maris would have to be inside the other caverns before the change of guard. They would need time to negotiate the unknown depths, to locate the cages where the slaves were kept. Maris would carry a hammer stolen from the smithy where they had toiled such long and dangerous hours. It would have to serve. 23 keys were in the hands of slaves, scattered throughout the prison tents. It would have to be enough. There was no more time for delay. The sun was setting. The golden orb of Imran headed for the western horizon with astonishing rapidity. Haldred tried to swallow, but the dry touch of apprehension almost choked her. This night would see their bid for freedom, their desperate attempt at averting an immeasurable catastrophe. Too many things could go wrong. Too many tasks were entrusted to people she did not know and on whom she could not rely. Now that the moment had arrived, her efforts seemed so completely inadequate that she almost wished that she had not started out on this course. Yet it was infinitely better to be doing something, however desperate, than to sit and wait to be engulfed by the storm. She felt unwell sitting at table that evening, with unfamiliar aches in her joints, as if she had a touch of fever. There was no way she could force herself to eat anything. At the earliest opportunity, she retired to her quarters. Cura was there, awaiting her arrival. As she entered, the girl pressed something into her hands. It was an ornamental dagger with a jeweled hilt, small and probably blunt. She pulled it out of the sheath. The blade had been sharpened to a keen edge. She hoped fervently that it would not be necessary for her to use it this night. The hours leaked away too quickly now. Maris appeared in the tent door. He was covered in black from head to foot, his face darkened with soot, where it was visible through the slit in his head covering. He was unarmed except for the blacksmith's hammer shoved through his belt. As soon as the second watch commenced, they would make their way to the northern caverns. Was she really going back into that den of horror? Despite Balos' reassurances about the Ra, she struggled to overcome her fear and revulsion. If the powder was not applied correctly or sufficiently, she shuddered at the thought. Quickly she embraced Cura, who clung to her a little. The girl would take her place in bed in case things went awry, and the house was searched. Maris stood behind her, his face expressionless. The new guards were in sight, tramping towards their posts with a sergeant in the lead. Quickly now, she thought, as they slipped out of the tent and followed in the wake of the marching men. Haldred gripped the unlit torch as if it had the power to make them invisible. They moved from one shadow to another, noiselessly. Her breath was coming too fast, almost hysterically, billowing away into the cold night air. They had so far to go still. Maris was 5 paces ahead of her now. He seemed not to notice that she had fallen behind. She barely caught up with him at the outskirts of the tent city, when a roaming guard passed within yards of their hiding place. They crawled forward under the bright stars, till he was out of earshot. The short sprint brought them into the deep shadow of the hills. They were both breathing heavily now. Maris pushed on, feeling his way across the sloped rough ground, with Haldred close behind. It was difficult going, since they could not afford to slip or stumble on a loose stone. Any noise could give away their position to a watchful guard. They dared not walk up the pathway. There was no protection from prying eyes, and for the most part it was exposed to the starlight. The guards had retreated into the mouth of the cave to shelter from the cold. 3 torches were spaced at intervals around the irregularly shaped entrance, illuminating most of the area. 2 men leaned over a stone-ringed fire, blazing to one side under a slight overhang, while a third was settling down close by, wrapped in his cloak. In the distance, the trudging of feet on loose stones could still be heard as the relief made their way towards the further caverns. Haldred and Maris waited in the dark, pressing their bodies against the cold boulders below the pathway. Haldred now felt the chill of the night penetrate her close-fitting garments. It would be a relief to start moving again. Soon enough the returning guards passed by, boisterous and jovial now that their duty was complete. Still the 2 lingered, till they could no longer hear the retreating figures' conversation and jesting. They started their ascent with extreme care, testing each stone they stepped on before allowing their weight to fall on it. Slowly they worked their way around the illuminated area, till they were to the right and above the entrance. Maris silently gripped her arm and pointed. There were several broken ledges higher up the wall, allowing for sufficient crawl space to make their way around the guards. A section or 2 were exposed to the torchlight, but it seemed the safest way to avoid detection. Haldred's heart was in her throat. Perhaps she ought to let Maris attempt this without her. They had planned to split up if one had to cause a diversion to distract the guards, though he would have been the one to do it. There had only been a slight possibility of both being able to slip in unnoticed. She motioned to him that she would stay behind. Maris shook his head vehemently and mouthed the word easy. She shrugged and nodded, feeling only a little reassured. The youth moved forward, pressing against the stone, what seemed to Haldred only an inch at a time. She waited till he had worked his way through the first illuminated area before she started out. It was easier going now that she had his example to follow, but her heart hammered in her chest, and she breathed through a gaping mouth in order not to make a sound. By the time she reached the spot where he had been, her arms and legs were shaking. She glanced at the guards, plainly visible from this section. The seated one was snoring lightly, which was fortunate, since he was facing in their direction. The 2 by the fire were conversing in low tones, their backs turned. Maris was experiencing some difficulty up ahead. A gap separated the ledge he was on from a wider one directly opposite the guards. He would have to reach for it and pull himself up. Haldred knew she would require his aid if she were to cross such an obstacle. They would be scarcely 10 yards from the men below and fully exposed to the torchlight. She hesitated. Maris beckoned to her urgently, his eyes wide. He was already kneeling on the larger ledge in plain view. All the men had to do was turn. Then she was too hasty, almost forgetting herself in the sudden panic. She reached for his hand, struggling for balance. In a nightmare she missed it and crouched down where she was, frozen in fear. Every moment she remained there, Maris could be discovered, yet she knew there was no crossing the gap without making a noise. In this close space the slightest sound would be noticed. Haldred looked up. The young man stared at her in dismay. Then he turned away as if searching for something. He found a small loose stone and showed it to her. He made a throwing motion and then held out his hand. She understood. The sound of the pebbles striking rock just outside was unexpectedly loud. Both men at the fire turned. Glancing at each other, they took a few steps to look about outside. The sleeping figure did not stir. With strength born of desperation, she clambered onto the ledge, hurrying after Maris as quickly as she could. When the guards stepped back into the cave opening, they had to be out of sight. The ledge took them round a corner into a smaller chamber, where the dull reflected light from the torches was the only illumination. Iron bars, spanning the width of the passage, made further progress impossible. A large gate had been set in the middle at floor level. It was open. Maris slid down and turned to assist her. Haldred had to lean on him when she had her feet on the ground again. Her entire body was shaking. She almost dropped Balor's bag of powder when she brought it out. They slipped through the gate and a few yards further down before opening it and spreading the contents liberally over their clothing and onto every exposed area. It was eerily quiet in the cavern. They felt their way forward for a while before lighting the torch. The floor sloped downwards with crude steps cut into the stone from time to time. There was no discernible smell that could penetrate the stench of the powder they were wearing. A large cavern opened up about them, appearing even larger than the one Haldred had seen before. As with the other, almost the entire floor area had been flooded, with a narrow causeway allowing passage to the deeper caverns. They quickly understood why the guards had neglected to lock the gate at the entrance. Any slaves shut in here, if they could manage to free themselves from their cages, would have to run the gauntlet among the swarms of Ra hanging from the dark ceiling in their vast numbers. Not that there were that many visible here, Haldred thought. But then Balos had mentioned that the greater part would be in the water, transforming into the running scourge that would tear Ligurium apart. Every few steps they took across the raised causeway, a stirring on the surface would catch her eye, or a splashing sound would float across to them from somewhere out of sight. Haldred gripped the torch with one hand and held onto Mara's sleeve with the other. She sensed a scream building up inside of her that threatened to escape at any moment. Once she stumbled and almost dropped the torch. She imagined an eager movement all around her in the water, in the invisible reaches above, and grabbed the powder bag to sprinkle about her the only protection they had. Maris looked at her strangely, and she stopped the futile exercise. For a moment she smiled hysterically, thinking of the priests in Aruis spreading the first of the wheat at the harvest festival. She had little idea of how much time had elapsed since the change of guard. It felt like many hours. Had the uprising started already? Were Balos and the freed slaves this moment setting fire to the barracks? Deep beneath the hills of Frane's Point, they would not be able to hear the sounds of war outside. Perhaps whether their attempt at freeing the slaves here would succeed or not did not even matter anymore. This thought relieved some of the tension fraying her nerves. Besides, the worst was over. There ought not to be more guards waiting for them at the slave pens. Ahead there was a low illumination spreading from a wide passage off the flooded cavern they were in. They had to be getting close. A platform greeted them at the further side of the pool. A short ramp led upwards to the lit tunnel. Haldred doused the torch, glancing behind her as she did so. The tunnel suddenly seemed a friendly place. The slave cages were rough enclaves, shut off at convenient intervals where the structure allowed. Here and there were piles of what appeared to be rags. The small, scurrying forms of rats fled before their approaching feet. Torches were placed far apart. Yet Haldred noticed quickly enough in the dim light that the cages were empty or sparsely populated. Where had the slaves gone? Had they been misinformed? They had not progressed far when a man stepped out of the shadows to bar their way. He did not seem alarmed or surprised at their presence here. Indeed, Haldred had the odd impression that he was expecting them. In his hand was a large iron ring with several keys on it. They halted abruptly, and Maris reached for his hammer. Before he could take a step towards the man, a familiar voice filled the space about them.
Please, Princess Haldred, return to your tent. They do not know who you are. You could escape still.
Haldred tried to make sense of what she heard. She had half expected that this was one of the slaves sent here to help, when the figure had not appeared surprised or threatening. Why else would he carry keys if not to open the cells for them? But now she was completely confused.
Balos? What are you doing here?
I waited here to warn you. We are discovered. It is no use.
Waited? What do you mean?
Haldred stared at him. What was the man doing? Why was he hesitating?
Give me the keys.
She lunged forward to grab it from him. He pulled back, preventing her.
There are soldiers waiting.
Something in his manner made her suspicious.
How do you know this? Balos?
Our plans are known to them.
The stark truth became plain to her.
You've betrayed us.
He could still look her in the eye.
Why?
Many reasons. But chief among them is to win Hekan's gratitude and favor.
Haldred felt the hopelessness rise up in her. How could this be? Did the fool really believe his life would be spared?
You are condemning all these people, and many thousands more besides them.
Balos shrugged.
You cannot stop it. The swarm will go out from here and destroy the old world. If you are not part of the new one, you will perish with the rest.
His voice was tired, resigned.
Thousands have died here already. Southlanders at first, from the wars in the jungles.
but he kept me alive with some others, because we are worth something to him. And now I will be worth more.
Their eyes were wide with horror. The man grew uncomfortable under her stare.
It is too late,
He said,
It was too late a season ago. Most of the Ra are sated and have dropped into the pools. At the end of leasing, they will hatch once more and crawl out as swarmlings.
Haldred found her voice again.
You knew this. You knew this. And yet you let us plan and work and hope. All to betray us to that monster.
Balos took a step towards her, and she shrank back from him. His voice was imploring now.
Please, there cannot be much time left.
The sight of him made her want to lose her mind. If she had the strength, she would strike him down where he stood and end his selfish, cowardly dream right here. Instead, she looked helplessly at Maris and turned, with anguish closing up her throat, to flee back down the passage. They paused only to light the torch. A false step on the causeway could cast them into the horrible black water of the cave. Haldred fumbled with the flint, the shattering realization of Balos' betrayal and their resulting predicament making her clumsy. Halfway across the pool, they were brought up short by a sudden glow from the exit tunnel. With trembling fingers, Haldred put out the torch. They broke into a stumbling run. If they could make the far shore in time. At the narrow turn they could barely see, Maris put a foot into the water, and Haldred almost tripped over him as he went down. Lights appeared ahead of them. A shout sounded from the direction of the cells. Balos was playing his part. She would not waste her strength hating him now. It could wait for when she was safe. They reached the shore, uncertain whether they had been spotted or not. The noise from the men shouting seemed to fill the cavern about them. The guards lingered in the doorway, waving their torches about. Apparently, they were not wearing the protecting powder, and would not venture further into the cavern. Haldred and Maris concealed themselves among large rocks, and waited for an opportunity. Their breath racing, their eyes wide with apprehension. Both were close to mindless panic. Peering cautiously from their hiding place, they could make out two guards, carefully treading their way onto the causeway, holding their torches in front of them, as if to ward off the hordes above and below. The third man was out of sight. Maris gripped her arm and nodded towards the tunnel. They would make a run for it. As quietly as they could manage, Haldred and Maris dashed towards the opening. The men on the causeway turned to give chase. The third guard appeared from behind a boulder and moved to cut them off. The youth had fallen behind Haldred to stay between her and the pursuers, allowing the other guard to close in on her from the side. The man grabbed hold of her wrist, causing her to cry out in pain. Maris struck him from behind with his smithy hammer, and she twisted free. The young man's voice, hoarse and urgent, goaded her on.
Run!
There were sounds of a scuffle in the dark behind her, receding rapidly as she turned the corner into the mouth of the cave. The gate was lashed into place with makeshift loops of rawhide, through which a lock had been closed. Hurriedly, she drew the small dagger Cura had given her from its sheath, and started on the thongs. A dull cry reached at her out of the tunnel, dragging at her nerve. Finally, the lost loop parted, and she could shove open the gate. Haldred hesitated for a moment. Would Maris follow? Had he been overpowered by the three guards? There was no way to aid him. Swallowing down a sob, she started out into the night once more. The camp was in an uproar. Squads of warriors ran this way and that amidst a din of shouted orders. Torches flared everywhere, till it seemed the place had indeed been set ablaze by the slaves. It was surprisingly easy to slip back into the palace tents. There were no patrols here yet, and the guards stood about peering in the direction of the barracks or the holding area. Once inside her quarters, Haldred sent Cura out for water, while she ripped the soiled and smelly black garments from her body. They would probably have to be burnt, but this was not the time. Any passerby would notice the smell. Quickly, she poured what water remained in the pitcher into a basin. She splashed the water over her head and shoulders. Something would have to be done about the odor of the powder still clinging to her. Haldred frantically grabbed the first vial that came to hand. Pulling out the stopper with her teeth, she sprinkled the contents over her body, her hair, the piled garments on the floor. Cura rushed into her room, hurriedly securing the flap behind her.
They are searching the house. They know there's a woman involved. A guard almost caught her in the caves. She will have a heavy bruise on her arm where he gripped her.
Haldred took the full picture from her. The guard who had taken hold of her in the caves was still alive then, and Maris had not returned from the cave. Had the youth's wish been granted at last? Had he gone to join his master in the afterlife? The water was icily cold. She had Cura wash the remaining powder from her neck and back while she looked at her bruised arm. Yes, the man's finger marks were clearly visible in dark bluish hues. There was no way she would get away with it if she were examined. One more risk would have to be taken. Outside, there was a commotion growing louder. Protestations could be heard from the room next to hers. Haldra turned to face the girl.
Take my place.
She whispered urgently. Gathering up the dirty garments in her arms, she crawled behind a corner stand, draped with flowing garments that should have been packed away earlier. There was a sharp command at the door. Cura disheveled her hair and made a face as she went to answer it. Maris did not get an opportunity to strike a second blow. Strong hands closed on him from behind and quickly pressed him down onto the stone floor. He struggled frantically, but a blow to the side of his head sent the torchlight wheeling about him in painful circles. A ringing had started in his ears and seemed to be growing louder. The men were shouting too, as if there was not clamor enough already. Something was wrong. The guards screamed and flapped about them, waving the torches. For a crazy moment he wondered why they were trying to fly away. Wings beat about them in droves, and the screaming was so loud he was sure his head would split. The Ra were descending on the unprotected men, tearing at them in a frenzy of fangs and claws. The torch dropped next to him, sputtered and went out. Maris closed his eyes and covered his head with his hands. He lay still, thinking of the neglected prayers of his childhood. Slowly the screaming faded away to a low whimpering, which he momentarily realized was coming from his mouth. He placed a trembling hand over it and looked about him. The bodies of the guards were sprawled between him and the exit. They were covered with screeching, fluttering creatures, competing for space. Keeping his eyes fixed on this grisly sight, he started crawling away to his left, trying to work his way around the hordes to the opening. If the powder could keep them off him long enough. They were shouting outside. Was it Haldred? Had she been caught? He cowered among large rocks, uncertain, his escape cut off. Men appeared in the opening. They stopped short of the sight of their comrades on the ground, horror written on their faces. Maris retreated further into the darkness. Would they know that he still lurked here? Were they searching for him? The soldiers did not attempt to chase the Ra off their prey. Instead, they slowly retreated up the passage till Maris was left alone in the cavern. There were 2 torches still burning on the ground, casting a dim light for him to see by. There was no way out now. He would have to wait for an opportunity, here in the horror-filled dark. Maris took another step, into a shallow pool. Drawing a sharp breath, he leaped back in fright. There were a few scattered pools about, small and insignificant compared to the veritable lake they had passed over earlier. A strange sight greeted his questing eyes. Several urns, half as tall as a man, huddled together on a rocky platform amid the pools. 1 or 2 had been turned over on their sides, apparently empty. What would be stored in such a place? Resisting the warning in his terrified mind, he crawled over to find out, taking care not to place a limb in the water. The smell told him what it was, even before he could see anything. The urns were filled with the powder Balos had sent them. Of course, the guards would protect themselves when entering the cavern proper. This was where they did it. The ones outside right then would have to send for more of the powder from elsewhere before they would venture inside. He was safe from them for the moment, but he was not safe from what they feared. Scooping handfuls of the stuff over his head and body, Maris felt some of his fears subside to a manageable level. Despite himself, he must have fallen asleep. All seemed quiet in the cavern. He had no idea how long he had been sleeping. Was it morning already? The niche he had wiggled into was comfortable enough, protecting his back and sides from surprise attack. The reek of the powder was a constant reminder that he need not concern himself with the Ra as yet. There was a growing light near the entrance. Men were entering the cavern, moving towards him with caution. He drew back, holding his breath. They were probably making their way towards the stash of powder. They would not know that he was still hiding here in the shadows. He could hear splashing sounds as they waded through the shallow water. The small pools round the platform had to be safe then. There was no conversation among the men. He could sense their nervousness. Orders were issued to them in low tones by an unseen party, perhaps an overseer. For a while he could hear the scraping of hands and the shuffling of feet round the urns. Then a loud swearing exploded from the midst of the group, causing Maris to start and knock his head against the protruding stone above it. He leaned forward to discover what had caused the commotion. The overseer was beside himself. Among the garbled marshland phrases, Maris could make out the reason. Careless application of the green powder had caused the quantity of it to be spilled into the closest pool. Fear of the creatures kept here was mounting among the guards who had to enter the caverns regularly. They covered themselves with a deterrent in liberal quantities, even pouring handfuls inside their garments, rubbing it behind their ears and sprinkling it on their hair. The session round the urns had become almost ludicrous in its intensity, one man's fear igniting that of the next, till each one vied for space enough to don his protection, perhaps before the others could. The resulting frenzy of application had caused an urn to overturn and spill half its contents. At first the youth believed it was the waste of powder that so irked the overseer, though there certainly was enough of the sulphurous substance standing about in their large earthen vats. However, when the Marslander took hold of a spear and retrieved the dead form from the water, the truth became apparent. He flung the small body of the bat, its wings limp, onto the ground in front of the guards. Pointing the spear at each in turn, he demanded to know who was going to explain to Hekan that their carelessness had poisoned the water and caused a number of bats to die. Did they not know it was the dangerous time, the sensitive stage for these creatures? Varus drew back into the shadows behind the rock. More than ever now, he had to get out and warn Haldred. It could be that the gods were about to give them the opportunity for which they had prayed. Cura wrapped the bandage with its herbal infusion packed inside, tightly round the arm of her mistress. Haldred made a protesting noise at the discomfort, but did not complain. The quicker she could rid herself of the glaring evidence of a rebellious excursion into the caverns, the better. She would not put it past Hekan's chamberlain to search the house again in the middle of the night. The fawning Bandar would like nothing better than to present his master with another conspiring wife, captured in the act of sedition. She bit her lip. Maris was lost to her. Her best effort had been wasted, her only hope shattered. It had taken but one miserable man to betray her, in a miserable attempt to save his miserable life. Balos of Ligerium. She fought against the bitter tears of anger. There would be no stopping it now. Malvor would be swept aside as if he was not there. The borders of Ligerium would be breached at Nicoma. And from there, it was but a short distance to Amorous, where her parents now shared Perian's table. If only Malvor's messenger had reached them, there would be a chance.